be stuck. So you should be very clear as to how to do the analysis, what type of analysis has to be done. And then probably after the analysis has been done, you will find the findings, and how do you interpret the finding is another important factor. And after drawing the interpretation, you may have to draw the conclusion for your research is concerned. So this is the the broad research process that is involved in the social science research. Then I think I will not talk about the earlier phases, earlier stages. So I will stick my discussion to the interpretation and drawing a conclusion for the research data is concerned. Okay, so what is, let us say, research? What is the interpretation of that? I think, okay, why it is not moving? Just a minute. Okay. I think there is some problem. Okay. So what is interpretation? How we have to, let us say, interpret the data is an important component. So when it comes to the interpretation of the data, why we should interpret the data? So the need for interpretation is a factor. Okay. Okay. So the need for interpretation. So that is very useful in the research findings, usefulness of research findings. So you do the research, and until unless you interpret in a particular manner, the entire research would be useless. So interpretation is very useful in research findings, usefulness of research findings. So you do your research, and when you communicate it to the others, so how do you interpret your finding is an important component. So usefulness of research findings is first one. Basic component of any research. So when you do research, you will have the result, you will have the findings and the result, and then what do you do with the result? Especially when we talk in terms of you subject the data to statistical analysis, and when you do the analysis, so what do you do with the data? So you find so much, let us say, you may be talking in terms of percentages, you may be talking in terms of t-table, you may talk in terms of correlation, whatever that be. So what does that particular correlation mean? So others, or if any other individual reads your research, the person should be able to make meaning out of it. So what does that correlation mean? You may find a negative correlation, you may find a positive correlation. How do you, let us say, interpret? So interpretation play an important role. It is a basic component of any research. And then interpretation will help in drawing inferences and verifying the hypothesis. Okay, so you have the data, analyze the data, subject the data for analysis, and after that particular analysis, what is the inference which you draw? What is the conclusion you draw? And then whether the hypothesis that you have framed is being accepted, rejected, why it is so. So all that is possible with the interpretation is concerned. So the need for interpretation is that it is helpful in drawing inference, and it would be helpful in verifying the hypothesis. And then through the interpretation, one can find meaning and relationships, etc. So probably when we talk in terms of research is concerned, right? We say that the in social science research, as I said, when you have a lot of let us say data, and when you start analyzing the data, you find that you may do what is called as post hoc analysis. So that's what what do you mean by post hoc analysis? Post hoc analysis refers to the analyzing that would not have been framed in your research objective, but that could be a when you are starting analyzing the data, you may find that that particular a particular variable, say for example socioeconomic status, so that itself may have a different meaning, and then you start analyzing, and then that play an important role in the interpretation of your let us say research finding, or it gives a different meaning to your research is concerned. Okay, so that is the reason why interpretation play an important role. Okay, so what is interpretation? Okay, so interpretation is an art. So this is an important factor. So how do you put your findings in a more meaningful, in an attractive manner is an important component. So that is where interpretation is an art. Okay, so this is where you should learn, when you talk in terms of research skills. So one of the skill that you have to develop would be in the form of interpretation. How do you interpret? So that becomes let us say, a skill. It is an art. So you have to develop that particular skill. That is the first component. And it requires specific skills and practice and experience. Over a period of time, you will learn how to, let us say, interpret, because probably the later slides I will discuss about it, how the experience play an important role, and your practice of writing play an important role. So it requires specific skills, practice, and experience. And then it would be, one important component when we are talking in terms of interpretation would be cautious about the wrong interpretation. So this is a challenge that we need to look into. Probably in the next few slides, I would be talking about what are the implications, what are the the temptations that the researcher is likely to make while interpreting the data. Okay, so these temptations make an individual to interpret a particular manner, which may not be correct at all. Okay, so that's a factor that we need to look into. I'll do one thing. There is some problem with the presentation, so I will share my presentation later on. Okay, so I will continue with the let us say the lecture. Okay, so that is the importance of the interpretation. So the meaning of interpretation, actually, when we talk in terms of defining a concept, when you say interpretation of research findings, the meaning of interpretation is that it is the effort to establish link between results of a given study with the theory, findings of other researchers, and the explanation of a phenomenon. Look at the component now. Okay, so it is an effort. So the researcher tries to make or establish link between results of a given study. You do a study and then you have your findings of your research in your hand with the help to the theory. What is the theory behind on which you have developed this particular research and then conducted this particular research? Findings of other researchers. So of late we find that the researchers, young researchers at the beginning stage of the research say that nobody has done this particular study at all. I am the first person to do the study. But it's not correct, especially when we talk in terms of social science research. The angle in which you would have looked at the problem may be different, but there are different ways in which a problem can be analyzed and then can be looked into. And that is where you have to relate your research finding with the earlier research findings. It may agree or it may disagree with the earlier researchers, and you may have to let us say explain why it agrees or why it doesn't agree with earlier findings. That is where the interpretation play an important role. And then the explanation of a phenomenon. Okay, so after relating it to the theory, after relating it to the earlier studies, you explain your research objective or your research findings in a particular manner. So this is where you talk in terms of explanation of a phenomenon. So research, when you say interpretation, it is an effort on the part of the researcher to establish link between results of a given study with the theory, findings of other researchers, and explanation of a phenomenon. Okay. Now, when we look at, let us say, research, okay, research interpretation or finding interpretation of the research findings, there are three major components of the, let us say, involved in the interpretation. The three components are, the first one is the data. Okay, what type of data, how much of data, the nature of the data is one. The second one is, it is the analysis of your data. And the third component would be the actual interpretation. Now, when we look at the data can be homogeneous or heterogeneous. To what extent the data are similar to one another, to what extent the data is dissimilar. The data can be representative. Okay, how far the data is representative of the sample selected, of the population sample selected, and how it represents the population is another important factor. And then whether the data appropriate or not, okay, whether the nature of the data that is collected is appropriate or some irrelevant information is collected, and the trustworthiness of the data. Now, this is another important component, especially nowadays. What we find is that when we talk in terms of technology, okay, you use Google form for your research. And when you use a Google form for your research, the reliability of the data is an important factor. So how do you know that the respondent has answered in a more reliable or trustworthy manner is an important factor. Okay, so what happens there would be the interpretation would be affected by a wrong data or an incorrect data or the data which is not reliable at all. So data can be in terms of homogeneity, heterogeneity, representativeness, appropriateness, and trustworthiness of the data is an important component. Okay. The next one is analysis. So how do you analyze the data? So that is where the simple thing for a very, very long period of time, especially in social sciences, analysis was restricted to frequencies, percentages, graphical representations, pie charts, the bar diagram, and these were the common let us say analysis that were done. But now with the help of statistical packages that is coming in, so you may talk in terms of SPSS or R or the Atlas TI or n number of packages, softwares are available. And when you have these softwares, how does these softwares help us in analyzing? So that is where the appropriate statistical tests are being used or not, how these tests are being used, whether you use a parametric test, whether you use a non-parametric test. Probably I will discuss this when it comes to the interpretation of data. I will come to that slightly later on. And then you have a graphical. This is where an important component. When you say graphical representation, the bar diagram or the pie chart and etc. So what happens there? Wrongful interpretation I was talking about. Okay. So when you show your finding in the form of a bar diagram or a histogram, now you are comparing, let us say, urban and the rural, and then you have seen, you show in the form of a bar diagram. The actual difference may be, say, for example, if it is in terms of, let us say, frequencies, it may be 49 and another may be 51. But if the scale values are different, what will happen? The visual interpretation gives an implication that that 41 bar representing 51 seems to be very high, and whereas compared to the 49, but actual difference in the value is only 2. Okay, so this is where the graphical misrepresentation of the data using the graphical representation is an important factor. And then the interpretation comes in. Now, when it comes to the interpretation, one point which I repeatedly make, or which I repeatedly state, is that this is an important component for all researchers or any researchers in any field for that matter. Statistics, application of statistics is important because it adds on to your validity, the accuracy of your findings and etc. is concerned, no doubt. But you should know that no statistics will go against the common sense. Okay, so you would have done a statistical analysis, you would have found a particular result, but before you start interpreting, use your common sense. And what does your common sense say? So if your common sense says that your finding is against your finding, then think twice, or again go back to your data and then think whether your finding, whether your statistical analysis is correct, where have you gone wrong? Because what happens is, whatever the analysis which you have done is because you are using the variable, you are using a measure which is more reliable, and all that is taken care of. All the controls you have taken. Despite all that controls which you have taken, if your finding says something else which goes against the common sense, there must be something wrong. So you should be very careful with regard to that. So one important component with regard to the interpretation is that no matter what analysis you do, right? So no statistics will go against the common sense, and use a common sense before you start finally interpreting your research data is concerned. Okay, so that's the three components of the interpretation: the data, the analysis, and the interpretation are the three components of let us say the interpretation is concerned. Now, before you go to interpret your data, you should ask several questions to yourself. So what are those questions? We will see. When once we are clear about these questions, pose these questions to yourself, probably that would be helpful in making a correct interpretation or accurate or meaningful interpretation of your research findings concerned. Okay, so what are those questions that we should follow? Okay, the questions that we should follow are: first one, what makes the study important? Okay, so you have the research finding. Okay, as I said, when you talk in terms of let us say research findings, okay, so why your finding is important? What is the your study, in what way your study is important other than when compared to the other studies? Probably when you are doing a research, you would have found the need for the study or the gaps in the research. So how far your research has helped in bridging that particular gap play an important role. So while you are interpreting your data, now you should focus on, or rather the question would be, what makes your study more important? Okay, so probably when we talk in terms of nowadays in some of the social science research, what we do would be a particular study, say for example, if we're talking in terms of pandemic, how developed country have dealt with their pandemic situation, and whether the same thing can be applied here also. Okay, whether that would be more applicable here, or very recently we were talking about every state uses its own model to deal with the pandemic situation, whether that particular model would be applicable to the other states are concerned. Okay, so can we say that the same model would be more useful? And if you use it, if there is a failure, then what are the reasons for the failure of this? So in what way you try to say that your finding is more important, or is is important compared to the gaps in the research is concerned? So the first question would be, what makes your study important is the first question. Do the findings make sense? You have found something. Okay, you have found something, and then how far your finding makes sense to you? Okay, I was talking about the wrongful interpretation, isn't it? And I was talking about going against the common sense. Now, why you say that whether it makes any sense? Now, another example, probably you have some hands-on experience on let us say factor analysis, or some of the SPSS hands-on experience. Okay, so when you get a SPSS output, you find that SPSS is a software which deals with the numbers or the data that you feeding. Okay, and normally, so another classical example I make is that especially this happens in social science research, when the researcher is not familiar with numbers, researcher is not familiar with statistics or mathematics. So what does he do? After collecting the data, he will give it to the let us say statisticians for doing the analysis. One of the important component which we normally use in our research would be the gender. So in say for example, if you want to analyze the data, so if you take an earlier version of let us say SPSS, where it will take only the numerals. So what do? You give the number 1 and 2, 1 for male and 2 for female, and then the first thing which you do would be find out the mean. So what do you find now? You apply the go to analyze, find out the mean for gender. So you will find mean of gender of 1.5. Now, what does this mean gender 1.5 mean? 1 means male, 2 means female. Then what do you mean by 1.5? Got the point? So what happens now? You have the finding. The table tells you that the mean gender score is 1.5. Then you have to think whether this 1.5 makes sense to you. So rather than blindly putting the table saying that the mean of the gender is 1.5, think and then ask a question. is it making any sense? So this is where you find that it is not making any sense at all. Remove that, and that's not making any sense at all. Okay. So do the findings make sense is a factor that you need to look into consideration. And the third question that we should ask is that who conducted the research and who is writing the report? Now, this is another important factor. When you are doing a research, now suppose, for example, doing a research as a researcher for the, let us say, PhD degree, or you are doing a research, as a funded project. Okay, so what happens? You may do the research. For the purpose of doing the research, you may hire or you may appoint few investigators or research fellows, etc. So who conducted the research and who wrote the report? So there are three factors that are there. You may prepare research synopsis, you may prepare research objectives, etc. You may you may appoint a research fellow who will go to the field and collect the data. And then the third person, you may appoint another senior research fellow who will write the report. So what happens here now? You are writing the synopsis. You are clear what are you looking for, what are the objectives, and then the research fellow goes to the field, collects the data, whether how much he is clear about the synopsis, about the objectives, and how does he collect the data, how does he record the data, and then there is a third fellow who is writing the report based on the data that is being given to you by your research associate or a research fellow. So this is if you yourself alone is responsible, then what will happen? So you are clear about your synopsis, you are clear about the data you have collected, and you know what is right, and that's where you try to, let us say, interpret. So if three people are there, if more than one person is there, now you should be clear about all these factors. So any time a question comes in, a doubt rises, now you may have to involve those individuals also. Okay, so that is one component. And who published the report is another important factor. So whether it is the universities or whether it is the bodies that has funded your project is a factor. Depending on that, the language you use in writing the report also tend to vary. So interpretation of your research findings. Suppose, for example, if you do let us say statistical analysis, and then you use a high funda statistical term. Okay, R value is this much, and then F value is this much, or covariance is this much, etc. If the person a layman wants to read this, then the person cannot make any meaning out of what you have written. So that is where, so who will be publishing your report, or suppose you yourself tend to publish your research later on, how are you going to interpret these is an important factor. So that's a factor that you need to ask yourself. So who publishes the report is a factor. And then did the researcher select an appropriate group for study? This is another important fact. Before you interpret, now ask this question, whether the sample which you have collected is appropriate. Okay, is a question that you need to ask. So the next question that you need to ask is that if comparison groups are used, how similar are they? Now this is another question. When you have different urban and rural, you take, or literate and illiterate you take, or developed or underdeveloped or developing, you say. So when you take in terms of these factors that are there, so whether that can be comparable. I was talking about homogeneity and representativeness. Many times the groups, you may use a comparison, but that comparison may not be correct or accurate because of the variables that you find. Okay, so that's a factor that you need to look into consideration. Okay, so the next question that you should ask, okay, is what has changed since the information was collected? Now this is another important component. I was talking about the research has a time frame. So when you collect the data, and then when you are interpreting the data, if the time gap is too long, then what is likely to happen? What you are finding may not be applicable. Your finding may not be accurate at all. Now I was talking about the pandemic. If you take the example of a pandemic situation is concerned, so you collect the data, and then by the time you report your finding, if the pandemic has come down or if the pandemic situation has increased, so what will happen? The time gap between the two, is an important factor. And then during this particular time gap, what all has happened, whether a particular measure has been taken by the government or by the NGOs or etc. So suppose, for example, when we talk in terms of let us say vaccination component is concerned, when it comes to the first phase and when it comes to the second phase, why there is a sudden rush, sudden report of the vaccine being the supply of vaccine is being less. Now, is it because what exactly has happened? So the awareness among the general population would have increased, and that is where there is a huge rush. And then so this could be one of the reasons why there is actually the quota that is being supplied may be the same, but the demand for that would have increased. Why there is a demand is because of this. So you should be aware, aware of the fact that what all would have happened during this particular course is an important factor. Okay, so that's another question that you have to let us say ask. Then, does the study establish causation? Now, this is another factor that tend to depend upon your research objective or your research methodology. Now, whether a particular phenomenon that you have observed causes a particular phenomenon. Now, especially when we talk in terms of, let us say, correlation research, we find this particular aspect. See, you may find the correlation between the two, but correlation only will tell you that whether the two things are related or not, and it will not answer the question that A causes B. Now, suppose, for example, if you're talking in terms of this example, I was talking about pandemic, whether literacy is an important factor causing the acceptance of vaccination or not. Okay, can we say that all literate individuals will voluntarily go and take the vaccination? It causes. So can we say that it causes? So causation for acceptance of vaccination is affected by the literacy, or the only the educated people will take, or etc. So that's where does the study establish causation? Many times it may not be possible at all, because especially when we are dealing with the social aspects of the phenomenon, what happens is it is very dynamic. Social behavior is very dynamic, and when it is dynamic, so you can't say that the finding which you have done will be accurate or will cause, because several other variables which the researcher is not able to understand and control at the time of research itself is a factor contributing to failure to establish causation of the particular behavior is concerned. Okay, so does the study establish causation or not is a question that you have to ask. Okay, the next is the time frame long enough to identify the impact. Now, this is another important factor. So if you are making a particular phenomenon, a social phenomenon, transition is taking place. Okay, so when a transition is taking place, what is the period that is required for the transition to take place? So if you observe a phenomenon for 1 month, if you observe a phenomenon for 3 months, whether it is sufficient enough to come to a conclusion, make a meaningful interpretation is a factor. Okay, so this is, say, for example, the many of the suggestions that is being given, measures, policies that is being thought of with regard to dealing with the pandemic. Or say, for example, when the BPO and call center came to India, what has happened with regard to let us say the entire work dynamics is concerned? Whether night shift should be there, whether the rotation of the shift is an important factor, whether the all these are the factors. Can we come to the conclusion that the stress that is experienced by the workers can be attributed to which, and how to handle this particular factor? Everybody comes out with their own strategies, their own policies, whether it will be whether now when we talk in terms of BPO call centers, it is more stabilized, and the individuals may not experience that amount of let us say the stress and strain which they in the earlier years experienced, because what has happened is the companies have thought of or have learned the strategies to deal with some of these phenomena is concerned. So whether the time is sufficient enough, the time frame that is being used is sufficient enough to draw a meaningful conclusion is another question that you have to ask before you start interpreting your finding is concerned. Then the next question that you should ask for yourself is whether the data be biased as a result of poor research design. Now, this is another factor. Many times, the research design which you would have adopted may not be appropriate. So, result would be more biased with regard to that. So, probably when we talk in terms of, let's say, sampling, we, say in most of our, let's say, research cases, we find that you use in social science research, we use what is called as a purposive sample. Okay, so when you use a purposive sample, you know that you are collecting the data or you are selecting the sample from whom you know very well that will fulfill your research objective. That is where when you say purposive sample itself defy or go against the actual component of drawing conclusions and drawing inferences, accurate inferences and conclusions are, etc. So that's where the you should know about the research design, whether your research design in terms of methodology that is followed, the data that is collected, the way in which the finding is being analyzed. So these are all some of the errors that can come in, and be aware. Before you start interpreting the data, think again or go back to your research design and then see whether there were any lacunas, whether any deficiencies in your research design, so that based on that, you can plan your interpretation of the data. Okay, so that's another question that you may have to make. And then the last question that you have to, let us say, ask yourself before you start interpreting would be, are the results statistically significant? So you find that the difference is there. Suppose, for example, you find the difference between the male and the female, whether the difference which you have observed is statistically significant or not. Okay, so if it is not, suppose, for example, you say the mean of, let's say, male is 22 and mean of female is 23 or 24, let us say. Now, if you make a comparison between the male and the female in terms of the mean, you will find the difference between the male and the female is 2, and then female mean of the female is greater, and that's where you may draw a conclusion that female. Suppose, for example, if you're talking in terms of work performance, and you say mean of work performance of male is 20 and mean performance of female is 22, and then based on the mean difference, you say that female are better in their work performance, whether it is statistically significant or not. Though in terms of the mean, the difference can be 2, but whether that 2 can be really be 2. Okay, because I normally say whenever you talk in terms of the mean is so mean that you can't rely on that. How do you get the mean? You may get the mean. Suppose, for example, I was talking about 20 and 22, isn't it? So 20 could be based on, let us say, if 5 individuals are there, their score can be, let us say, 19, 20, 19, 20, or 21, 21. Find the 5 individuals' total score, divided by 5, you get, let us say, 20. Whereas, in terms of, let us say, the female, it can be 0 to 2 individuals would have got 5, 2 individuals would have got 30 and 40. So when you divide all 5, we take the total and divide it by 5, you may get 22. But what happens there? So there is wide amount of individual difference in the case of female, which could have attributed to the higher mean, but which may not be statistically significant when you actually compare the male and the female is concerned. So that's where you should see whether the result is statistically significant. This is one case of a, let us say, statistical interpretation. Another case of statistical interpretation, if you go for a inferential statistics, if you go for further, let us say, statistical analysis, you may find, say, for example, you do a factor analysis, and then the the total variance is around, let us say, 50%. Okay. Now, whether that particular 50% is sufficient enough to draw meaningful conclusion is a question. So you would have done the analysis. That analysis would have given you the result. Okay. But whether it really has a implication for your research finding is a question that you may have to ask before you start interpreting the data, interpreting your findings is concerned. Okay, so these are some of the questions that you may have to let us say follow when you are actually before you start interpreting your research findings. Okay, so the next factor we will try to discuss about the factors to be considered in while you are analyzing or when you are interpreting the research findings. Okay, the factors that need to be considered, especially when we are talking in terms of let us say a study which needs the data, whatever be the type of data which you have, and the data need to be analyzed and data need to be interpreted. So how do you interpret your research finding? Okay, so factors to be considered is whether you are using descriptive statistics, whether you are using inferential statistics, what is the significance level that you are trying to make use of, whether the degree to which the data is representative, the data has certain biases, and what is the sample size, and what is the error margin. Now, these are some of the factors. Now, let me spend few minutes on each one of these factors. So the first factor to be considered is descriptive statistics, whether the data that you have collected describe a particular phenomenon. So probably your frequency distribution, pie charts, bar diagrams, histograms, okay, percentage analysis, okay, all these are descriptive statistics, whether you are trying to describe your findings in terms of as it is. So it can be how many number of individual, suppose for example you have collected the data, you can analyzing the data in terms of socioeconomic status maybe. So you may have lower class, you have middle class, within the middle class you have lower middle class, middle class, upper middle class, then you have let us say upper class. In upper class you may have different strata. So describe your sample in terms of this. That itself will be the first step. So though you have collected few hundreds of the sample, now when you try to describe this particular sample in terms of 6 or 7 strata based on socioeconomic status, you may find that it may not be equally representative. Okay, so in one group there may be only 5 or 6. In another group it may be 100 and odd. In another group it may be 50. So that is first factor which will help you. Can I make an analysis? Can I make a comparison across all these 6 strata of classification I have got, or whether I may have, what is it that I have to do? So that is the descriptive statistics. How do you describe your findings? Your data is the first factor. Whether you make use of tables, whether you make use of graphical representation, whether you, what type of, the manner in which you try to interpret your research finding, okay, is the first factor. So descriptive statistics is the first one. The second factor would be the inferential statistics. Can you draw a meaningful conclusion? Can you verify your hypothesis using the inferential statistics? Inference means drawing the inference based on your finding. So there are several, let us say, inferential statistical techniques that are being used. Probably the most popular, let us say, inferential statistics that are being used in most of the social sciences are, say, for example, you may be familiar with the t-test, you may be familiar with ANOVA. Okay, so whether the observed difference between the two groups is statistically significant or not. So that is where you use a t-test. If more than 2 groups are there, you find the differences which you find across the groups, whether it is significant or not. That is where you make use of ANOVA, or analysis of variance. Now, with the help of, let us say, softwares that is available, several advanced, statistical analysis can be used, inferential analysis can be used. So you may draw a structured equation model, you can use path analysis, or you can use factor analysis. There are several techniques that are being used, or the tests that are being used before you draw the conclusion or the inferences based on your finding is concerned. So that's inferential statistics that is being used. And then the statistical significance level. This is another factor that we need to look into. So probably those of you who are familiar, who have reached the stage of, let's say, analyzing the data, and when you have started getting the analysis done through SPSS or through R package or etc., you may find that you find that the 0.5 and 0.1 level of significance. What does this particular 0.5 and 0.1? Why we should have only 0.05 level or 0.01 level? Okay, why can't it be 0.10? Okay, so depending on your nature of the study, in most of the social science research, it is not necessary that it is not compulsory that you should have a significance level of 0.01 or 0.05, because researcher finds it very difficult to identify the those factors or those variables which could have an impact. Probably when we talk in terms of research, you say independent variable and dependent variable. You may be clear about independent variable. You may hypothesize about the relationship between independent and the dependent variable, but there are several what is called as the confounding variables or extraneous variables or moderatory variables. So it would be very difficult for any researcher, especially in the social science research, to identify all the variables that could have an impact, that could have an effect on the relationship between independent and dependent variables. So as a result of it, there are several errors or the biases that can seep through your research. And that is where the significance level play an important role. That's where when you're talking about error margin, how much of error margin you should give, you should allow, how much of chance factor would have influenced your research finding is a factor that need to be taken into consideration. So in social science research, when you are doing probably all of you may be familiar with, say, for example, the research or the interpretation of the data during the, let's say, elections or the poll results are found. Okay, so when the predictions are being made, how far those predictions are accurate? What are the factors in which the predictions of whether a candidate or whether a particular party will win or not? So that is where lots of variables it would be very difficult for you to control, and that's where most of the time these predictions may go wrong. So that's where you talk in terms of the significance level. So you can go for 10% chance factors rather than 5% or 1% that is normally considered as a significant level. So that's a factor. So statistical significance level or the error margin is a factor. How far you can depend on, or how do you set this particular error margin is a factor. So if the sample is heterogeneous, okay, it is not representative of the population, then probably the error factor, the chance factor would be more. So you have to give room for more room for chance factor, and you can't say that it should be 5% or it could be only 1%. Okay, so that's a factor that you need to look into consideration. So when it comes to, let's say, interpretation, there are several errors that can take place while you are interpreting the research findings. So what are the common errors that are there, and then how to deal with these common errors, and then the guidelines for the research interpretation we will try to discuss. Okay, so what are the, let us say, the common errors? So the common errors in research interpretation are, the first one, the common error due to bad data. Okay, so the bad data itself may not be correct at all, and that's where it could be in terms of wrong design. The design itself could be wrong. So when your research design is wrong, the entire interpretation with the data which you get would not be accurate, and the interpretation goes haywire. So that's the first component would be the bad data. The data would not be accurate or because of the design. The design itself, the methodology you follow could be wrong, or you say, for example, normally we make use of a questionnaire, and when we talk in terms of a questionnaire, okay, questionnaires can be of two types. You say one is closed type and another is an open-ended question. So when you say closed type, what will happen now? There are no options for an individual to give his or her response. It would be restricted only to say yes or no, or agree or disagree, or true or false. So when you try to let us say, understand a particular phenomenon, make a comparison based on those who have said true and those who have said false, you may not find the representativeness of that particular data itself. So qualitative analysis or qualitative report of that particular, so the questionnaire itself may not be appropriate at all. So that's where the bad data is a component, or error can be there because of the bad data. The data itself may not be accurate. So that is where, based on the inaccurate data, you try to make an interpretation. So that's a common error that you find. So when I was talking in terms of the demographic variables, you would have collected the data. Say, for example, when we talk in terms of religion, for example, there may not be accurate, or say, for example, you make use of a socioeconomic status. So when you say a socioeconomic status, how do you, the normal thing you take in terms of socioeconomic status, whether you say, how do you say whether an individual is poor or not? So the poverty, how do you measure? What are the measures of poverty? So you would have used a scale to measure the poverty. So those who live in slums are considered to be poor. Okay, now whether that particular, so if you go to, let us say, the criterion that is being used to define poverty. So if you go to slum, in front of, on the top of every single house in a slum, you'll find an independent TV antenna. Okay, one of the member of that particular person may have a two-wheeler. Now, can you call that as a measure of poverty? So the design that you have used to collect that particular data itself may be wrong. So bad data is the first error that can come in. Okay, the second error that can come in, this is more crucial. Okay, error that can take place is data management is a factor. Okay, now this is how do you manage the data? See, you talk in terms of analyzing the data. Now, thanks to, as I said, several packages that are available. So all of you are, most of us, or most of the researchers are trained to, prepare a master sheet or put the data in an Excel sheet and etc. And when you put the data in an Excel sheet, and then from the Excel sheet, you shift that particular, or give this Excel sheet to the statistician, or you yourself, you are familiar with, okay, copy paste this Excel sheet to the, let us say, SPSS or basic sheet, and then start analyzing the data. So the first thing that a researcher may have to do, or a statistician has to do before you start analyzing, would be dust the data. So what do you mean by the dust the data? So when you are analyzing this particular data, there are lots of errors that can take place, and some of these errors you may not be aware of it at all. Suppose, for example, you are putting the data in terms of gender. I was talking about 1 and 2. While putting the data, you look at the name and then put in terms of 1. And if the the name seems to be a name of a male member, you put 1, female, you put 2, etc. And then while putting it, you find that you have done a mistake. Instead of 1, you would have put 2. So what do you do now? So normally you say you put you want to correct it, so you enter 1. So in that cell, what would have happened is it would have become 12, or it would have become 21 without erasing the earlier entry of 2. So if you would have put 1 before 2, it will become 12. If you have put 1 after 12, it will become 21. When you start analyzing the data, this 21 also will be added, and when it start analyzing, finding the mean and etc. is concerned, the entire data becomes wrong or gives a wrong interpretation. So the statistical package is not doing anything wrong, but the way in which you have put the data, there is something wrong. And at times, when you are using let us say, a sort of a questionnaire or a type of questions, you may find that if the questions are asked in one particular style, people may go wrong. In order to check the reliability, you would have reversed the, let us say, the questions. Okay, so the scoring should be reversed. So for one question, if you say strongly agree, you give 5. Strongly disagree, you give 1. For an opposite question, it should be 1 for strongly agree and 5 for strongly disagree. So while analyzing the data, now probably you may go wrong in this. Data management here refers to, you may not consider that at all. Okay, reverse scoring is an important component that can come in. Many people come to me or go to a statistician and try to analyze. There may not be any difference at all in the data. That could be because you would have failed to look into this particular reverse scoring component is concerned. So when you look at the data itself, it should be possible for you, whether that's where I told you, no statistics will go against the common sense. So there can't be any gender with 21. Okay, like that. That's one particular factor. Reversing scoring is one particular factor. And another point I was talking about, while you are managing the data, before you analyze the data, is that the temporal importance. Okay, so what do you mean by temporal importance? The temporal importance is that the importance of the time. When did you collect the data? And when you are reporting or analyzing and reporting the data is an important factor. Okay, so that's a factor that you need to look into consideration. Okay, so that's where the temporal relevance, whether it is relevant today or whether it was relevant at that particular point of time, it may not be relevant today at all. Okay, is a factor that we need to look into consideration. Okay, error that can take place. And then the error can be possible with regard to the, let us say, the statistical analysis which you do, or the errors that can take place. So probably we are familiar with what is called as, I think you may be familiar with the terminology, what is called as type 1 error and type 2 error. Or you may also be familiar with one tail and two tail test. I think I will explain this two components so that before you start analyzing the data, interpreting the data, this becomes very much clear. What is type 1 error and type 2 error? The simple example for type 1 error and type 2 error, in a very comical manner, which I normally give, is that if you are familiar with the two incidences from our ancient literature, okay, one is, say, for example, the story of, let us say, Mahabharata, or where you find, say, for example, the incidents of, the Bharata, okay, Dushyanta Shakuntala story, where these two fell in love when Dushyanta was in a forest. They become entangled, and then after a particular period of time, Dushyanta leaves, gives a ring to, let us say, Shakuntala, and says that you can come back, and etc., and totally forgets. And then Shakuntala delivers a baby called Bharata, and then takes Bharata to the kingdom of, let's say, Dushyanta. And then what does Dushyanta say? Dushyanta says that I don't know who you are, and that person is not my son at all. Okay, when it is true, don't accept that as true, is type 1 error. Okay, so type 1 error would be a phenomenon is true, but the researcher may say that the finding may not be true at all. So that's one error, type error. Another type of error, again, if you go back to, let us say, the incidents of Drona and Ashwatthama in the Mahabharata itself. So what does the thing happen? So Drona is a very powerful warrior, and nobody can defeat him. And then, so what happens? So the Dharmaraya, who is supposed to be a person who always tells the truth, utters a sentence that Ashwatthamo Hatha Kunjaraha. So what do you mean by that? Ashwatthama happens to be the son of, let us say, Drona. So he makes a statement that the elephant named Ashwatthama is no more. But the sound that is there around doesn't make it clear. Drona cannot hear the word elephant. He only hears that Ashwatthama is dead. So he leaves the battleground and goes back with sorrow and etc. So what happens there? It is not true, but the researcher says that it is true. So type 1 and type 2 error is a factor that you should be very clear with regard to that. Similarly, the another, let us say, the factor that when you are making an interpretation would be type one tail and the two tail tests are being used, whether the interpretation can be restricted to type one and one tail and two tail. Now, when you talk in terms of one tail and two tail, which are these tails we are talking about? The tails we are talking about is the tails of the normal distribution. So when you have a normal distribution, okay, so when you say normal distribution, all 100, the characteristic feature of a normal distribution is that when you cut this particular normal distribution at the center, you have two equal halves. So when you put both the halves together, it will represent the population. You have only the sample. So sample can be only one half. So one tail refers to your finding is applicable only to the sample that you have, let us say, analyzed, test, collected, analyzed, etc. So that is where one tail. Your finding is no doubt true, applicable, but cannot be extended onto the population. Two-tail test is the one where your finding can be applicable to the larger population also. Though you would have studied let us say, a small sample, your finding on the sample can be extended onto the population also. So this is where one tail and the two tail. So that tend to depend upon the requirements. So what type of sample size is an important factor, representativeness of the sample is a factor. So based on all those factors, the clarity with regard to this, the control which you have taken, based on this, it would be possible for you to, let us say, be clear whether your finding can be restricted only to your sample or whether it can be extended onto the population also. This is where the error can come in. Okay, so be aware of these factors. So the significance level or the technique that is statistical technique that is being used and the errors that can take place. And then the error also can be possible in, let's say, the communication. So how are you going to communicate is a factor. So when you are writing, okay, the publication, citation, so on all these components also, there can be errors. So how do you interpret the, let us say, especially when we are talking in terms of, let us say, writing the discussion based on your research finding. As I said, when you say interpretation requires, has three components I was talking about. One is relating it to the theory. Another would be relating it to the earlier studies, and then trying to, make a phenomenon in this concern. Okay. There is some technical problem with regard to the PPT. So what I will do would be, after this, I think I will mail the PPT so that everybody can have access to that. Okay. So there seems to be some problem with regard to that. Okay. So, okay. So in communication, there is a problem with regard to that. Okay. How are you going to communicate is a factor that can look into. Okay. So that's it. So how do you publish? So when I was talking in terms of, say, relating it to the earlier studies, how far your finding or your interpretation, your understanding of the earlier study play an important role. So the earlier study would have been on entirely a different socio-economic factor or a cultural factor, which may not be directly applicable to your culture or your socio-economic conditions are concerned. And if you try to say that your result is in accordance with the earlier research conducted elsewhere, now whether it is correct or not. So that's a factor that you need to take into consideration. So when you are publishing, when you are reporting, when you are giving a citation, whether you are right or not. So probably when we are talking in terms of, say, now measures have come in with regard to the plagiarism and etc. And when it comes to the plagiarism, so this is where when you talk in terms of human beings are so clever that whatever that is being done, you find a means to take a circumvent and then try to analyze. So when you are citing this particular component, there are experts who say that if the, let us say, plagiarism rate is high, they themselves will suggest you how to reduce that. So you change the sentence from active sentence or passive sentence, or you may say that a particular word is dropped or a particular, so as a result of it, the plagiarism comes down. So whether the citation is accurate or not is a factor. So these are some of the, let us say, common errors that can take care of. Now, so based on this, we will try to discuss about some of the guidelines that could be followed while interpreting the your research findings. So what are the guidelines that are there? Okay, the guidelines are the first one, find the story in your data. Okay, this is an important component. Now, especially in social science, of late, when the craze for numbers, craze for statistical analysis, craze for the making use of these let us say packages are there, your discussions of your research finding is becoming more mechanical, more structured, and more restricted to a particular format in terms of tables, in terms of statistical tests, in terms of interpretation of statistical data, etc. The art of writing is totally missing. Okay, this is an important factor. So especially when you are talking in terms of a social phenomenon or a social science problem is concerned, when you started analyzing, when you started thinking of research problem and research objectives, the ideas that was there in your mind, the factors that you could not introduce into your research finding would have been totally lost. And then before you actually start analyzing, go back and then try to analyze whether those factors could have influenced your research finding. So that's an important factor. So make that particular, say, find the story in your data. Make that is an art and make it in the form of a story. Okay, so that's an important factor. So story can be, in terms of three types of stories. The stories related to the hypothesis, what made you to form this particular hypothesis, and then trying to making more interesting interpretation of the hypothesis. Analytic story, when you have analyzed this particular data, okay, so what does that particular analysis tell you? I think another example which I normally give for this would be, when you do a factor analysis, I was talking about factor analysis. So what happens is all those things which are closely related to one comes into emerges itself into a particular factor. Okay. Now in social science research, as I repeatedly telling you, there are a number of demographic factors that looked into. This is an example which one of my, let's say, research student got this particular result. Okay. We were trying to analyze the, the stress of a particular occupation is concerned in a given occupation. So we have collected the demographic variables and then gave this to a statistician for factor analysis, and then did the factor analysis, and then so many factors emerged, let us say. So let us say, for example, 4 factors emerged. And then once you do a factor analysis, when the factors emerge, the researcher has to give name to that particular factor. Factor 1, factor 2, factor 3, gives a meaning into. So I found that the 3 factors were there. One is related to the job, another is related to the nature of the work, organizational factors, and the third one, something like came in. So within that particular factor, one of the demographic variables got attached to it. Okay, so 4 items were related to the job. 5th item in that particular factor was nothing to do with the job at all. It may be related to the type of, let us say, marriage was a particular factor. We were trying to see whether the occupational stress was influenced by the nature of the marriage, whether it is the love marriage or arranged marriage or etc. So this particular factor got into a particular phenomenon. So there is no, another observation I was making, think in terms of whether your data makes sense. So I was saying that out of these 5 items that has emerged as a factor, 4 items are related, but the 5th one is not related at all. So, but in the factor analysis, that is a factor that is being added. So I asked a statistician, what does it mean? So the statistician said, if it is not meaningful, drop that. But for a researcher, especially in social science, if it has attached to that, there must be something which would have contributed to that, whether it is because of insufficiency of the data, whether, so that is where it becomes, while you are making this particular factor, you find. Or say, for example, when you're talking in terms of religion, a particular religion, respondents belonging to a particular religion may show a entirely a different, let us say, result compared to the others. But the number of individuals belonging to that particular religion may be very less. So when you are analyzing, though it has emerged as an important finding, but you may have to interpret whether you are justified in analyzing and interpreting that particular finding is an important factor. So make the hypothesis story, the analytic story, and the mystery story. So how it would have emerged. So as I said, you would have observed a particular phenomenon. Now, say for example, the classical example, you normally say, you talk in terms of superstitions. Okay, whether a hardcore, let us say, scientist can be superstitious. Now, many times we find that all of us, we know very well, especially during, let us say, Dasara time or Ayush Puja. So what all happens in our offices. Okay, so you know very well, computer is only a machine, and then that is only an instrument that is being used for our own purpose and for a particular purpose. So it is nothing to do with, so what happens there? The clerk or some people or you yourself say that you put 3 stripes of vibhuti and kunkuma and etc. on a computer. Okay, what does it make? Actually, it blurs the, let us say, the monitor. Clear vision may be affected. But so what happens there? You have a feeling that so can you say that you are a computer scientist or you are a hardcore scientist, and then computer scientists do not believe in all this and are not superstitious? Can we say that? So make a mystery story. Then what makes an individual like that? So I am a particular teacher in physics. I talk about all this, superstitions are nonsense and etc. And when I go back home, I am a strict, follower of religion, or religiosity is much more. So what happens there? How do you explain this particular phenomenon? So make a mysterious story out of the data that you find. Probably when you talk in terms of outliers, when you start analyzing the data, majority of them will follow a particular pattern. But there are few individuals who are on the extremes. Analyze, make a story out of these, individuals who like. So everybody says, say for example, if we have collected the data from 50, 40 individuals, responses may be more similar. 5 individuals may be totally against. 5 individuals are highly, their scores may be 2 extremes. One may be very low, 5 may be very high. So this becomes an important factor. Assuming that the sample is homogeneous, what makes these 5 and 5 individuals to be different from others? We are happy with our statistical analysis with those 40. We are not happy with those 10, 5 who are very, very low, 5 who are very high. Okay, so this is where mystery story comes from with this. This is where in social science research, nowadays, the best approach for your research would be making use of triangulation. Mixed method approach design becomes an important factor. So when you use a mixed method, you would have used a particular method or a design for your research, but before you start interpreting your finding or analyzing and interpreting the finding, go for these outliers, try to explain, try to understand why these outliers are there, make a mystery, or why this mystery of these extremes come in, and try to interpret that. That's an important factor. Okay, so make a story, find a story out of these. So out of your data. So story can be hypothesis, story related to analysis, and the mystery story. And then present your finding is a factor. So present as it is, and then discuss your findings. How do you discuss your result is a factor. So discussion is not restricted only to the of late. What is happening is, what do you mean by discussion? Discussion is a narrative manner of writing the findings which you present in the form of tables. Okay, that's not discussion. Okay, in a table you would have said a statistical table showing mean, median, standard deviation, t table, t ratio, etc. So in your discussion. You write the mean of this group one is this group. That's not discussion. So discussion, as I said, when it comes to the interpretation, your finding related to the theory, related to the earlier studies, and then the finally objective of your study. So that's where the discuss your finding in terms of if it is in agreement with the earlier studies, if it is in agreement with the earlier theory, if it is so, if it is not so, say why it is. So you may have to go back to the theory, you may have to go back to your data, you may have to go back to your understanding of a particular phenomenon. So based on that, try to discuss your findings. Okay. So other guidelines would be in terms of be aware of the language which you use. Okay. So the language play an important role. Okay. So how do you communicate your research? So what is the language which you use? Depending on the subject matter that you study, each subject matter may have its own guidelines. Say, for example, most of the social science research follow what is called as APA, American Psychological Association guidelines for preparing the research report or writing a report, whether it should be on first person, second person, or the third person, whether your own personal biases comes in your interpretation, how far that can be allowed. Okay, so the language, the terminologies that you use, the slangs that you use is an important factor. So how far that is. So suppose, for example, you are preparing a research report for the purpose of a degree. You are publishing your research for a scientific body, or you are publishing your research for a layman. The language you use on all these three occasions should be different. So that's where the language play an important role. Okay, so use an appropriate, let us say, language. Be cautious with regard to the language is concerned. Okay, then indicate the degree of probability. So what is the probability that your conclusions are more meaningful or is likely to happen? So this is what, so definiteness of the, let's say, your inferences, definiteness of your finding is an important factor. So as I was saying, say, for example, you would have done a t-test and then you would have found it is significant at 0.40. Okay, so you are interpreting the t-test, but the significance level is not accepted, or it is much higher or much lower than the expected level of 0.05 and 0.01 level. So that is where what is the probability that you are likely to get this finding. Suppose, for example, if another researcher tries to understand this particular phenomenon or conduct a research in the same line following your guideline, what is the probability that the other individual is likely to get the same sort of a phenomenon? Or if you yourself repeat or conduct the study on another sample or etc., or taking in another variable, what is the probability that you are finding, you are likely to get this particular finding, etc. So indicate the degree of probability. This is another. The next factor would be keep a distance yourself from the claim. Now, this is an important factor. So what do you mean by that? Report the finding. Okay. The language in which you use, you report that, do not use the word I. Okay. So disclaim yourself or maintain a distance yourself from the claim which you make. So it is likely to, find this, or say, for example, it is likely that based on the, let us say, the finding, the relationship, if you say, or a particular phenomenon can be observed. Do not say that I have found that this is what the relationship, or I believe that this is what exactly is the reality. So maintain distance from yourself from the claim which you make is a factor that you need to take into consideration. Distance yourself from using qualifying verb. Okay, so your report should not have qualifying adjectives. Okay, so it should not have very beautiful. We do not use adjectives as a component factor. Qualifying words should be avoided. Say as it is in very simple terms is a factor. Okay, when you say very or highly, etc., that's where those are all the let us say normally the errors that can be made and that need to be let us say avoided. And then broad generalizations has to be avoided. So when you're making a conclusion, I was talking about one tail and the two tail. So the generalizing, do not make it that your conclusions are universal. This is more applicable in social science research, unlike in physical sciences, where accuracy is much more. In social sciences, accuracy is not possible. 100% accuracy of over the control of variables is not possible at all, and that's where the problem comes in. That the do not make generalize over generalization or broad generalization should be avoided. Okay, then few more let us say guidelines is that start asking questions yourself. So when you start writing discussion or start writing interpreting a particular phenomenon, start asking questions to yourself. Okay, so I have found this particular let us say the result. Then what do I do with this particular result? Can I report it? If I am reporting it, in what manner I am reporting it? Is it in terms of numbers? Is it in terms of earlier findings? Is it in terms of my own understanding? Is it in terms of, so start asking questions to yourself is a factor that you need to ask yourself. Use personal experience. This is another important factor. Use personal experience. Suppose, for example, as a researcher, you yourself has gone to the field and collected the data. So when you are collecting the data, you would have interviewed, you would have talked to the, let us say, individuals. And I was talking about outliers. Okay. So when you are starting interpreting the data, use your, let us say, the personal experience. When you say, for example, you have found an outlier, go back to that particular individual whose score is very high or very low and try to recollect what interaction you had with that individual. So that itself may give you some idea as to the interpretation of that particular, those outliers are concerned. Okay, use personal experiences. Your own experience is a particular phenomenon. And when you are using a questionnaire or when you are using a schedule to understand a particular phenomenon, the first thing that you should do would be you yourself as a researcher take those schedule, answer that particular schedule, so that understanding of your research problem from your own understanding will facilitate, and this result will help you in analyzing the findings of your research also. So that is where use personal experience is a factor that you need to take into consideration. Discuss with a peer. Okay, this is another factor. I have found something. What does this make sense, or what is the opinion of the other researchers in the same? So as I said, especially in social science, unfortunately in the academic environment in which we are in, we have restricted our discussion only to our angle or our subjective angle or our subject angle. I was talking about, let us say, giving an example of poverty. How does a sociologist define and perceive and analyze poverty, measure poverty? How does an economist perceive poverty? How does a psychologist perceive poverty? So what happens is, as a psychologist, I would have perceived poverty in my own manner and measured poverty in a particular manner and draw a conclusion. When I discuss, this is my finding with a researcher in sociology, now his understanding of my finding may be totally different. He may agree, he may not disagree, he may give a different explanation with regard to that. Similarly, if I discuss this with a researcher in who is an economist, so his understanding of my finding and interpretation of my finding would be different. So discuss with the peer. So that would give you a better understanding of a particular phenomenon for interpreting your research data is concerned. Okay. Consider the context in which the study was conducted, the data collected, etc. Now, this is another important factor. Okay. So consider the context in which the data was collected. So suppose, for example, you are talking in terms of, say, I was giving an example of pandemic. When you collect the data during pandemic and after the pandemic is over, when you reporting it, so what is the general level of anxiety, general level of fear about a particular phenomenon is different. And when it is not, suppose, for example, we are talking in terms of, let us say, the perception of, let us say, the pandemic of those who have not been vaccinated, those who have been vaccinated once, those who have vaccinated twice, those who are not vaccinated at all. And when you are analyzing the data from these, the context in which you have collected the data is an important factor. So perceived differences with regard to the pandemic, with regard to the recovery, with regard to all these factors related to the pandemic. If you are studying this particular phenomenon, those who have been affected, those who have been recovered, those who have taken vaccinated, the context in which you have collected the data are different across these 4 different sections of the population. Okay, so that makes a sense, or that gives a different meaning for you to interpret your research finding is concerned. So those who have been vaccinated twice, those who have been affected even after vaccination, or those who have recovered from the pandemic, so their perceptions are totally different. So the context is an important factor, and at what time the data collected is another factor. Temporal factor I was already talked about. Okay, and then whether your finding is related to the theory, existing theory or not. Okay, this is an important factor. So whatever the finding which you have found, okay, whatever the results which you have found, now can it be related to your research finding, your theory is an important factor. Ultimately, whatever the findings that are there has to be related to a particular theoretical aspect is concerned. Okay, so that's a factor. Can it be related to the existing theories of about a particular phenomenon is concerned. So these are some of the guidelines that you should follow. Finally, the focus of interpretation should be, now those were the guidelines that you should follow while interpreting your research findings. The focus of interpretation, I think this is the last point or the last slide I would be discussing about, and probably later on some of the questions, if any, I think I can add on to the clarification or answer those questions. Okay, so the factors of interpretation, the focus of interpretation are, the first one, the focus should be on the research question. So the primary focus of your let us say interpretation would be in terms of what is the research question which you have. Okay, so that's an important factor. So there are, as I said, especially in social science research, you have lots of information, lots of data you have, and then, as I said earlier, you will be stuck at different stages of your research, and one stage where you will be stuck up is while analyzing and interpreting your data. You have lots of information. Whether that particular information is necessary to answer your research question or not is an important component. So focus your interpretation on the research questions which you have raised, or the research objectives which you have raised is the first focus you should have. The second aspect of the focus is in terms of relation to other research. Okay, in what way your finding is in line with the other researchers that are there. Okay, so you may find, especially in social science research, socio-cultural factors play an important role. So if you say, for example, your finding is in accordance with the earlier findings of another culture, now knowing that the sample of your culture is totally different from others, how are you going to, let us say, draw a conclusion, or how are you going to validate, how are you going to make a meaningful interpretation that your finding is true? Though the the data collected is correct, the methodology you have followed is correct, the measure or the technique which you have followed to data collection is correct, but if the cultural differences are there, how are you going to explain? How are you going to say that you know very well that the sample of your research is totally comes from a different culture, then whether culture has not played any role at all. Now, this is an important factor. Or your finding may be in line with or may go against the findings of many other researchers concerned. Why is it so? Okay, so if many others have found a particular, let us say, finding, they would have found a significant correlation, but your findings say that there is no correlation at all. Then if that is the case, why is it so? Okay, whether it is due to the nature of the sample, whether it is due to the nature of the variable, whether it is due to the errors made in analysis. So relate to the other researchers' findings is another important, because as we said, the components of interpretation is, as I said, link it to the earlier research, link it to the theory, and making meaning out of it. So that's where this play an important role. So relation to the other research, whether it is related, whether it is not related. If it is related, how? And if it is not related, why? Okay, so these points to be included while interpreting your research findings. The next focus would be on the implications. Okay, so you have found, you have analyzed, you have collected the data, you have analyzed the data, and what is the implication of your finding? Whether that particular implication, whether in terms of the time, whether it is in terms of application, whether it is in terms of possibility of understanding a particular phenomenon, whether it is applicable or not. Implications of your finding is an important factor. Now, many times we find the implications would be too general or too generic, that the finding may not throw any light on drawing that particular generalization or the implication, etc. So be clear about whether your findings has implications. If it is implications, on whom, how long, to what extent. So that should be the other focus that you need to look into consideration. Then you have, as I told you, especially in social science research, the outliers is an important factor. Okay, so as I said, assume in any scientific research, we take a sample and we assume several, let us say, assumptions. So we say that the sample is homogeneous, sample is normally distributed, sample is representative. So many, let us say, assumptions which we make. How far those assumptions are true is an important factor. And in any research, for example, in any measurement, for example, there are, let us say, outliers. So outliers here refers to when majority of them follow a particular pattern, there are few who violate, who deviate from the normal, okay, who deviate from the majority of the individuals. So some are very low, some are very high. So consider these individuals is an important factor, because that will give you an actual limitations of your study. You may be able to understand when you start discussing the outliers. So these outliers, this is where how do you understand, how do you interpret? So there are two ways of, let us say, interpretation. One, understanding the outliers with the help of the other type of data which you have collected. Now, as I said, I was giving an example of the outliers in terms of analyze the outliers in terms of their demographic details. So you would have had, let us say, age, gender, religion, or whatever, depending on your, let us say, the research problem. Okay, you would have collected number of demographic variables. So when you looked at those 5 individuals who are very low on a particular variable, now you may say that all these 5 are common with regard to their age, whereas with regard to the others are concerned, it may not be. Then what can happen? Now you can look into whether it is because of the people belonging to this particular age, or those who are, the outlier is because of this particular. Then the direction for the future research would be would actually be that look into this particular age group, take more number of individuals with regard to that particular age group, and then examine a particular phenomenon or reanalyze this particular data. It may give a different meaning. So similarly, those who have very high score, look for the commonality, look for these findings. This is one way. From the available data, which you have not looked into, go back and then look at the data, and then whether those information will be helpful in interpreting the outliers is one factor. Another would be, if it is possible, if you have the time, then what can be done is that go back to those individuals, revisit those individuals, interview, collect the data, okay, make a focus group discussion, ask them, and then the other methods of analyzing, other methods of collecting, revisiting those outliers is another factor. When you revisit them, and then you may get rich information that is not being studied, not being included in your analysis may crop up, and that may help you in making a meaningful interpretation of your finding. Okay, so interpretation of the outliers is an important factor. This is more so. This is where when I said, research interpretation is an art, especially in social science, is that it is an art component coming here. So when you look into the outliers, when you try to start looking in deep about these outliers, what made them to be like this, now that is where it will help you in making a meaningful interpretation. Making a story I was talking about. So the story would be with regard, I was talking about mystical story. So mystical story would be in terms of this, looking into these extremes, and that would help in making a meaningful, interesting story and then interpretation of that. So that's the concentrate on the outliers. The last point would be need and relevance of post hoc analysis and its findings. Now, this is another, let us say, aspect of it. So need and relevance of post hoc analysis and its findings. Now, what do you mean by this? Okay, as I said, especially in social science research, you have a lot of data. You would have collected the data, and then when you start entering, or when you start tabulating, you will find interesting, let us say, data emerging. It can be in terms of differences in the socio-economic factors. It can be differences in the religion. It can be differences in many, let us say, social variables. You may find the differences. And then researcher will be curious to know whether I can look into the difference based on this. Suppose, for example, you say marital status. So if you are observing a particular phenomenon, an urban family. Now, when you look at, you are trying to understand a particular phenomenon. All right, let us say, for example, you want to know the work-life balance of urban families. Okay, so when you are looking at work-life balance of urban family, okay, you have collected the data about, let us say, 200 families, urban families. And when you start analyzing, or when you start, putting the data, you may find that these urban families can be in terms of both husband and wife go for work together, both husband and wife going to the same, working at the same place, or or on different shifts, whether they have children or not, whether whether their marriage is arranged or love marriage. So on a number of factors, you find the differences. So you may find a particular phenomenon. So you find urban families who have extended, so their in-laws or their parents are with them. So when you are looking at this, you may find that there are 30 individuals, 40 individuals out of a particular, let us say, sample size, who are different from others. Then that becomes, you become curious to know whether I can study this particular difference. Okay, so whether work-life balance of those who, let us say, the couple who are working in the same organization is different from the work-life balance of those who work in different organizations. Now, what happens now? So that analysis, you may become curious. Now, then you have to look into, suppose, for example, you find a difference between the two. Many times this is what happens. Statistical analysis, we may throw a significant difference between the two. Okay, but it may not have any theory. It may not have any, let us say, background or validity to explain this particular phenomenon is concerned. That's where I told you another sentence which I normally make is that no statistics will go against the common sense. The statistical test may tell you there is a significant difference, but in reality, there is no difference at all, or it is very difficult for you to explain that difference which you have found. So that is where, what is the, what type of post hoc analysis which you have to do? Post hoc, as I said, after getting the data, while analyzing, you may get curiosity with regard to looking to examine the different components or make use of different statistical tests, which was not thought of earlier. And when you start doing this, you may be stuck with this particular component. So many times you may end up with the result which is going against the common sense, which is going against the, let us say, the theory, and it becomes difficult for you to interpret. It is difficult for you to make an inference, draw inference, and even if you make an inference, that may be not correct at all. So these are some of the, let us say, the factors that you should concentrate on. Well, I think in a summary, as I said, the interpretation of your research finding is very important, is the important stage in your research. And as I said, it is a skill that's an important factor. So you start writing, that's one particular factor. So you write, you rewrite, and as I said, the questions which I have discussed earlier. So before you move on from one hypothesis to the other, one objective to the other, start asking question. Why I have done this particular object, put in objective, and in what manner I have tried to analyze this particular data, and what are the theoretical background I have, what are the research support I have, and based on that, can I make meaning out of the data which I have found? And if you follow this, probably your interpretation of your research finding will be more qualitative and would be more meaningful, and you feel you enjoy the interpretation of your research finding is concerned. Thank you very much. Any questions and clarifications? Probably I have another 10 minutes so that I can answer some of the questions that you have. No more questions? No questions? I know there was some problem with regard to my sharing of my presentation. So what
Sir, I want to ask some questions, sir.
Yeah.
I have one question.
Great.
Sir, as I am a research scholar from Kannada University, Tribal Studies.
Okay.
It is my research is regarding community studies. While interpreting the result or data, what will be affected of subjectivity and objectivity questions? It will be very important while we interpreted data about the particular community studies. As I belong to that community only, how it can affect our interpreting data regarding the subjectivity and objectivity.
Right. Fine. So this is an important component, especially when you're talking to your personal biases should not come in. Is one particular factor. But as I said, when you are interpreting a particular phenomenon, your experience, personal experience is an important factor. Okay. Belonging to one particular tribe makes you to interpret your finding from your own personal experience. You belong to that particular tribe. The phenomenon which you have observed, the finding which you have found, makes more meaningful when you interpret from your own background, your own experience is concerned. So that is where the bias is not there. Okay. But bias can, suppose for example, if another individual who doesn't belong to your tribe makes an impression, that would be wrong. Okay. That's one. And when you are making a inference also, one factor would be when you say subjective, how far your interpretation is not affected by your personal biases. That can come in. Objective evaluation of your experience and your finding should come in. Okay, that's an important factor. So probably when you are interpreting your research data also, that also can come in. One of the factors which we say, especially in the business terminology, they say use a disclaimer. Okay, what do you mean by that? My interpretation of this is being influenced by my own experience of this particular phenomenon. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
In that way, you will be more objective in
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
If you any more questions, please ask me.
Hello.
Yes. You can ask.
Sir, thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Okay.
My question is the interpretation of findings of qualitative research. I think you addressed everything, but I did not get qualitative research. How we can do the interpretation of qualitative data.
Fine. So
can you please guide?
Yeah. So when you are doing a qualitative research, this is where you make use of qualitative data analysis. So you may use narrative analysis, discourse analysis, grounded theory. Okay. So these are all the techniques that you could follow, but the guidelines for interpretation is the same. Okay. So suppose, for example, you are doing a narrative analysis, verbatim report. So how are you trying to understand that particular verbatim report? You make sense out of that verbatim, and then while doing it, your interpretation would be there. Along with that, also present the verbatim as it is. So that what will happen is acceptance of your interpretation by the others would be left to the evaluators, left to the readers, etc. See, there is a verbatim. You would have collected that particular verbatim. You have made sense out of that particular verbatim, and you will be expressing it in your own terminology or in your own words. Okay. Then you also, along with that, give that particular verbatim also. Because when we talk in terms of, let us say, qualitative analysis, narration play an important role. How are you, the language play an important role. So understanding of that particular language, putting it in a language that could be understood in a more scientific manner play an important role. So that's a factor. That's a key factor in, let us say, qualitative analysis. Some of the, let us say, the packages that are available, the same, let us say, caution also may have to be. We may use word cloud or in vivo or, these are all the, let us say, the techniques that you could follow. When you say you are making a sense out of, let us say, word cloud. Okay, if you are familiar with Atlas TI, you get, the entire data in a pictorial manner or in a different qualitative manner. How are you going to interpret that? Word cloud, suppose, for example, how far these words are interrelated with one another. You may have to make sense out of those words that are there. While making that, also go back to your, the steps that are there in the research is the same. In interpretation is the same, but the technique or the tool which you use is an important factor. That is where the nature of the sample play an important role. So when you do a qualitative analysis or qualitative research, the quality of the sample play an important role. You would have studied only 5 individuals, but how extensively you have collected data from those 5 individuals or 5 cases play an important role. Whereas in an empirical study, 5 is not a number, is a very meager number. It may be 50, 500. From 500, you are making an inference. Whereas if you are making the inference based on 5, the much more in-depth analysis of those 5 individuals play an important role. The guidelines are the same, but the precautions or the focus is the same, but the manner in which you collect the data and the type of data which you get is different in a qualitative research.
Is that our interpretation must be accepted by other researchers? I mean,
need not be. That's what I said. See, when you make an interpretation, especially in social science, there are several conditions or the structure that you would have adopted to make the interpretation. If the assumption is not true, then automatically others need not have to accept that particular factor. Of late, especially in social science research, I find even in my own subject, say for example, psychology, of late researchers, again, when you say, for example, research, chapter 3, that is methodology play an important role. After methodology only, your data collection, interpretation comes in. But in actual preparation of a research report, of late people are writing research methodology after analysis is done, because they want to say that whatever the hypothesis which you have done should be proved, should be accepted. It is not so. Okay. It is not that whatever you have done, whatever you have thought of should be found correct, should be acceptable. Okay. If everything is done, if those assumptions are true, and if you have controlled the variables to whatever manner that is possible, to that extent, if despite it, if your results are not in accordance with the hypothesis, state that it is not so. You yourself need not have to accept your, let us say, findings, your results, let alone others. Okay, so it is necessary that others should accept your interpretation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Okay, okay.
So any more questions? So can I conclude the sessions? Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Thank
Good
you,
afternoon.
Dr. Ashok, sir, for your elaborative speech on interpretation of research findings, the levels in interpretation for research findings, and the need and its relevance in various kinds of research. Thank you for this enlightful session, sir. I thank all the participants who are actively presented in throughout the lecture. I thank all of you. Thank you. And also, I would like to thank organizers, Karnataka State Council of Science and Technology, and also Tala Samudayagala Adhyayana Kendra, National Law School of India University, and also Chandrasekhar sir, and also who are directly or indirectly helping to arrange this session and also lecture. Thank you all, sir. Thank you. Sir, shall we end, sir?
Yes, we'll.
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay,
Please
thank you.
fill the feedback format.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ashok sir.
Thank you, thank you.
Sir, please send the PPT of this session, sir, please. Chandrasekhar.
We will share with WhatsApp group.
Okay. Thank you, sir.